My name is Dr. Corey Johnson. I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo, and I have the good fortune of teaching a class at the University of Waterloo for our first and second year Ph.D. students called Foundations of Knowledge, and we affectionately call it our Philosophy of Science class. I also have the good fortune of being a part of a group that decided in the midst of pandemic that we should maybe put together a graduate student speaker series. And so, as you may or may not know, that's now been hosted by Clemson and the University of Utah. And we are the last one for this year, but there'll be a slate of speakers coming up for the new year as well. So look for that in your email inboxes. Because it is a graduate student course and a graduate student speaker series, I'm going to invite anyone who's not a graduate student to please turn off their camera. And I'm going to invite those of you who are graduate students to turn on your camera if you feel comfortable doing so. We will also have some rules in terms of the order of questioning after Dr. Berbary's talk, but Kellyanne, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, will help us manage that order. So I've invited Dr. Berbary to speak for as long as she wants, but she also has left some room for questions. And as I suggested, Kellyanne will facilitate that after she introduces our speaker. So let me introduce you to Kellyanne Wright. Kellyanne is a first-year PhD student in recreation and leisure studies. She has tons of fascinating insight into all of the philosophical orientations to science that we've been discussing, especially from a Western perspective. And she's also Dr. Berbary's student. So we thought it most appropriate that she get the opportunity to introduce her supervisor. So without further ado, Kellyanne Wright.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to have you all here to hear Lisbeth speak, and I'm so excited to introduce her. But before I do that, I would like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. So I recognize that we all are gathered from different spaces. However, I urge those of us who are settlers and uninvited guests to think about whose traditional territory you're currently occupying, the implications, and what we can do to mitigate those negative consequences. In the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather virtually for this talk is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We must acknowledge that the University of Waterloo is situated on land within the Haldimand Tract, and this is land that was promised to the Six Nations and includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. Acknowledging this reminds us that our gathering today is directly related to the continued dispossession of Indigenous peoples and occupation of their land. As a Black immigrant settler from Jamaica, I acknowledge that I was not invited here, nor have I been given permission to live on this land by an Indigenous person or an Indigenous community. I would also like to acknowledge my role as a racialized immigrant settler in the ongoing settler colonial project, which involves the violent theft of Indigenous land for resources extraction and conversion to settler property, as well as the policing of Indigenous peoples. The recognition of the continued violence upon Indigenous peoples on their lands, as well as the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples, must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. Lisbeth and I wanted to express solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs and all those aligned with them who are facing violence and dispossession by Coastal GasLink and the RCMP. For those of you who are not in Canada, the RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The Wet'suwet'en and their allies are protecting their traditional lands against the RCMP, Coastal GasLink, and the provincial government's invasion of unceded Wet'suwet'en territory. Just a few weeks ago, on November 18th and 19th, 2021, 32 people were arrested during brutal militarized RCMP raids on Gedemden territory. Wet'suwet'en people were violently removed from their own lands to pave the way for the fracking industry. These government and corporate-sponsored military actions are taking place in the midst of unprecedented climate-induced floods, storms, and a provincial state of emergency. So in order to not make this an empty speech act, Lisbeth and I ask that all non-Indigenous folks, if you cannot physically show up, please donate what you can to the link that I would provide in the chat. Thank you. I'll post the link in a moment. So we kindly ask that you click on that link and donate whatever you can. Now I'd like to turn it over to Lisbeth. So our speaker is a settler in Tkaronto who embraces new to her knowledges, theory practices, and coalitional spaces toward more liberatory existences. Her strengths are in building relations, learning along with students, and reading. She currently is focused on being in conversation with the works of the Red Deal, Abolition Collective, and her loving graduate students, including myself, among other radical think actors. Welcome, Dr. Lisbeth Berbary.
Thank you, Kellyanne. I'm so blessed that our paths have crossed. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for talking about our solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en peoples. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in. Are you all ready? Okay. This is the only talk that I have to give right now, and together those here today will join me in the middle of it all, in need for more complexity, yet inside the boundaries of a momentary talk. So please bear with me, and remember I'm still in the midst of making sense of what my dear friend Brian Grimwood might call my unknowings. Part 1, the world. Sarah Ahmed might ask, what is our use in today's world? A world where extractive forces of capitalisms, imperialisms, and colonialisms have humans and other than humans on the brink of extinctions. A world ravished by carceral institutions, police, prisons, the military, by settler and racial capitalisms and cannibal economies that put profit over people, death over health, antagonism over empathy, and competition over cooperation. A world whose sanctioned imperialist warfares, anti-immigrant sentiments, occupations, and ruling nationalism subjugate, disenfranchise, immobilize, disrupt, and exploit, spurring border brutalities, keeping us out, keeping us in, literally caging our humanities. A world where ongoing processes of what Fortier and Voiles call death-making, dispossession, and wastelanding continue on stolen lands, rendering environments and bodies pollutable as extractable resources, humans as inhuman extractable matter for profit. A world where accumulating settler deathscapes, as Barker noted, obscure lines between the living and the dead, conferring peoples and lands, as Rajak called ghosts, or as Dean called hauntings, the unmaking of subjects, the biopolitical establishment of what Yusuf called non-beings. The strategic targeting of Indigenous, Black, Two-Spirit, trans, queer, disabled, non-Black of color, aging, street-involved, migrant, imprisoned, mad, fat, sick, and poor folks. That liberal multicultural listing for which Tuck and Yang noted there are not sufficient alternatives. The violent construction of the inhuman race to uphold facades of security, economic development, and nation-making for the few. How easy it has become for coercive forces of governmentality to ignore peoples deemed mere apparitions of another time and place. And even to this very day, the need for some to be convinced towards Black liberations, rematriation of indigenous lands, redistributions of wealth, and climate justice shows the hypnotic force of upholding such ghost stories by those whom benefit from them. And disturbingly, for many, especially those with bureaucratic power, such fictional tales are entwined with selective perspectivisms and eurowashings, which coalesce to shut down and limit meaningful engagements with, teachings of, and possible reimaginings towards world storyings, or what Oyewumi called world senses otherwise. Violent closures of expansive potentialities simply because such possibilities emerge outside of or in departure from narrowly procured, taken for granted, realities of whiteness. Whiteness here as a concept, an antagonistic mode, a political formation of power, an extractive ontological state of relationality. And if anything is clear, it is that such whiteness has fallen out of right relation with anything but itself, its own destructive assimilative lure, its own encapsulating dominance, stagnant, and its own lack of imagination. And such lack of right relations otherwise has rendered whiteness out of touch, distracted, unaccountable, and disconnected from pluriversal realities, ways of being, knowing, flourishing, surviving, and ways of humility and humbleness. Whiteness as a mode demands supremacy, demands being apparent. Hegemonic whiteness finds itself seen, heard, and valued, uplifted, recognized, immortalized, even and often in infamy, bolstered by its often linked structural perks of accumulated wealth, ownership of production and colony. Whiteness balances between the scale of structure and the scale of the personal, among the simultaneous temporalities of yesterday, now, tomorrow. Its regime is felt everywhere. And whether structurally or intimately, whiteness as a mode of relationality demands dominance as its deepest desire, as the necessity of its own insecurity. And so living in well relations to whiteness, especially when articulated along with wealth, has often protected from threat, making the dangers of the earth now at times feel new as shifts occur, as death-making finally draws closer to one's own door. Perhaps the few begin to feel what the many have presently already felt. In particular, the Anthropocene and its promise of extractive capitalism, fossil fuel economies, and climate destruction has invigorated what some call new threats, conjures new dystopic realities of concern. But what privilege that requires. What relations must be refused in order to see dystopias as new? For the ending of worlds has not just begun. Mourning dystopic futurities is only new for those who have too easily been able to turn their backs, while the rest have had to watch ours. For many, living under threat has often had to become a constant state of flourishing. As Yusuf reprimanded, quote, "If the Anthropocene proclaims a sudden concern with the exposures of environmental harm to white liberal communities, it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly exported to Black and Brown communities under the rubric of civilization, progress, modernization, and capitalism. The Anthropocene might seem to offer a dystopic future that laments the end of the world, but imperialism and ongoing settler colonialisms have been ending worlds for as long as they have been in existence." End quote. And so when extinction feels threatening may instead depend on geopolitical location, racial formations, nation-making regimes, and capital accumulations or not. The luck of interpolation being born where you are either called to write history or to write, R-I-G-H-T, history, as your storied memories are erased, gentrified, denied, unhistoried, and buried over. Multiple extinctions, then, have always already been here, now, present, due to the atrocities of capitalist world-making that actively and deliberately make death of what we have been, what we are, and what we might become. Threats to humans and more than humans are not new. What may feel new is that world unmaking violences may now be able to reach us all. As Youssef noted, Black and brown bodies will no longer be the only ones charged with buffering the violences of the earth. And even more complicated, as the Red Deal reminded, is that to blame such threats on all of humanity accuses the wrong protagonist. Quote, framing this crisis as a pan-human problem or a problem of the species, such as the term the Anthropocene, misses the point. A select few are hoarding their life rafts while also shooting holes in a sinking ship. Class hatred is warranted. The immiseration of billions sustains the gilded lives of the few. We have to draw lines of separation between us and them. They aren't going to put themselves out of business, nor will the ruling elite put their own system up for debate. End quote. And yet, how else could we expect it to be under capitalism? For as the People's Agreement wrote, quote, capitalism is an imperialist system of colonization of the planet, end quote. An imperial system we all must resist for anything to become better, to resist its predation, its monetization and corporatization of relations, its logic of commodification, its resource extraction, and its closures of restoration. Predatory capitalism has disrupted how we connect, give care, build community, and share wealth. It has forced us into systems of underwage exploitation, privatization of property, and competition, where giving care itself, for oneself, for each other, for the earth, absurdly somehow has become contradictory to survival. As Cedric Robertson taught, capitalism has always been built on such antagonistic relations among ourselves, each other, and the world. And more so, those relations have always relied on constructed racial differences, forming and reforming racial identities into necessary hierarchies in order to deem who owns the means of production and whose labor must be exploited within them. Regardless of the races of the bodies present, reliant instead on new ways to racialize shades and colorisms. Sylvia Wynter reminded, quote, this code of race can only be brought to an end with the bringing of the end to our present mode of truth, together with an end to the absolutism of its economic categories, end quote. And so the power of capitalism is fierce, and equally fierce is its correlated necessity of colonialism, spurring Nick Estes to regrettingly ask, quote, why is it easier for some to imagine the end of fossil fuels than settler colonialism? To imagine green economies, carbon-free worlds, wind turbines, solar power, electric bullet train utopias, but not the return of indigenous lands. It is not an either-or scenario. Both are possible and necessary, end quote. And so in the entangled mess, we realize we can't undo racism without undoing capitalism. We can't undo capitalism without undoing imperialism. We can't undo imperialism without undoing colonialism. Such mess leaves us all, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, having to change everything. And this is something we can and should work towards if we want a better world than the one we currently live in. Mariam Kaba reminded us that, quote, changing everything might sound daunting, but it also means there are many places to start, infinite opportunities to collaborate, and endless imaginative interventions and experiments to create. What can we imagine for ourselves and the world, end quote. So back to the question, in the midst of a world wrought with unending division, hierarchies of worth, and politics of desperation, during continued climate destruction, COVID-19 death, housing and health crises, systemic racism, uprisings and protests. What is our use? Part 2, the institution. Where's the use of the institution of academia amongst it all? How can we be of use in making mess of this colonial apparatus? How can we queer our own use as academics, as researchers, as teachers? How can we use our bodies, ideologies, discourses, and relation towards terrains of alternatives? As Ahmed explained, quote, in ways other than for which they were intended, or for those for whom they were intended, end quote. How might we disrupt current meanings of professor, academic, scholar, and age-old notions of excellence, success, research, and teaching by making their usage or reusage strange, reorienting, disorienting, disabling, by reflecting, diffracting, and reorganizing through those leaky unhistories, politics, and loving relations that might otherwise be assumed apart from or outside of academia's concerns, focus, and usefulness. As Abolition Collective asked, how might we, quote, refuse to abandon the resources of academia to those who perpetuate the status quo, end quote, drawing those of us who are subversive scholars, radical think actors, and renegades harbored within academic spaces towards action for Black, Indigenous, and queer futurities and liberatory spaces of encounter that bring drastic politics to the forefront of world-saving possibilities everywhere. Might we reverse the directionalities of knowledge production to extract from the university towards sustaining ongoing resistances already at work in our communities? Yet, thinking such possibilities within the suffocating frame of the neoliberal institution is hard and perhaps impossible. And yet, while we might not ever be able to claim real abolition or true decolonization within a capitalist institution on stolen land, could we change something? Strive towards anti-colonialist knowing, detours around exploitation, and liberation of those incarcerated knowledges of counter-hegemonic ideas? Would even that be worth staying with, worth undoing and unbecoming to turn in another direction, to create cracks towards larger collapse eventually? Maybe, maybe not. Often I think perhaps my liberatory work has to occur outside the academy, in my community, in my parenting. Yet I can't help but let my politics follow me everywhere, even into spaces it may fall victim to overwhelming power, in moments where it may be contradictory, juxtaposed, or compromised. It is still at work, judging me, evaluating me, questioning me, motivating me to be better, do better, to keep becoming of more use. Regardless, even if one thinks it's impossible, it's easy to recognize that there is much work to be done through the academy to strive, as Angela Davis reminded, to, quote, adopt critical habits that require the constant criticism not only of those things we want to change, but of the ways we want to change them and of the tools we use to conceptualize that change. Remembering always that this is not the way things are supposed to be, and they do not need to remain this way, end quote. And so, can we do that work? Can we try to do something more? To be honest, some days I throw my hands up and think we might just need to abolish academia, and at the very least abolish the conditions under which education has become unattainable, privatized, a corporate state apparatus made only for the few. The epitome of Denny's fears of edutocracy, where imperialist sense-making reigns as intellectual hegemony, embodied through codependency on anti-intellectualisms, persistent acriticalities, and EDI initiatives that simply support liberal moves to innocence, rather than unsettle the organizing structures of the machine of empire itself. All moves towards a form of what Bristol might call pedagogies of hopelessness, towards the realization that there may not be any possibility for truly diverse academic futurities. And for some, education itself then may feel under threat, threatened anew by censorship, liberatory revolutions, critique, refusals, and resurgences of students wanting more, wanting different, demanding otherwise. Threatened by the deconstruction of dominant traditions, normalities, and status quo, threatened by diversity, Black initiatives, so-called decolonizing curriculums, and shifts in representation, even in innocuous liberal forms. Fear, guilt, fragility, saviorism, all converging to create for some a loss of positionality, loss of footing, loss of confidence and security in themselves, in the institution itself, in the abilities to heal, teach, and respond to the world, in the role of professors, supervisors, staff, and students, in our purpose and usefulness. Where must we each turn as the embodied enactments of that institution? What must we reject, resist, move from while we move towards, reimagine, liberate, and pluriversalize what has become, what is to come? How must we here today transform to be more useful bodies, activators, animators, or defenders against violent status quo? And can we do it in time? Can we expand from and resist against the violence of ordinariness which persists in the academy, and instead engage towards more radical values that get at the root of what must become otherwise for us to be or to remain of use? And in particular, we must, especially in the current moment, begin with more robust expectations of what promoting diversity means and does, or more importantly, doesn't do. Capitalist rebranding, remarketing, or representing are simply moves towards institutional preservation, not moves towards liberation. Such acts simply shift ocularist effects by infusing racialized bodies or commodifying equity as slogan-esque stuff to be owned as performative consumption. Both moves render diversity corrupt and simply insert bodies and representation into existing violent structures, ideological and economical. And as Joy James reminded, quote, if capital is financing our freedom movements, they are not freedom movements, end quote. Such moves instead render diversity as lacking grounded coalitional politics, as lacking specific structural demands, and as lacking a move outside of what Femi Taiwo would call elite capture, the dangerous practice of directing attention away from changing social systems towards instead simply speaking on the behalf of the most marginalized folk who haven't even entered the rooms. Elites, rather than building new rooms and new places with all peoples, simply engaging in trickle-down justice by doing just those acts that are easily surrendered. Ceding ground is to relieve guilt, create public acceptance, and appear liberatory. In this sense, current academic diversity initiatives rarely rework the ecology of precarious existence towards true structural liberation. At best, they promote tokenism, isolation, and conformity, where diverse bodies, as Andrea Davis resented, quote, merely register the performance of diversity, a box university administrators can check, a requirement the university can fulfill. To continue, as Angela Davis discussed, quote, that word diversity upsets me. The word has colonized so much of what we were once able to talk about with much greater specificity. We all now just have to evoke diversity. And what does diversity mean? Is it precisely only about that visual effect? I am not an opponent of diversity. I am an advocate for strong conceptions of diversity. You can have difference that truly makes a difference, but you can also have difference that doesn't make a difference that allows the machine to keep functioning in the same way, and at times even more efficiently and effectively. If we embrace weak notions of diversity, it is a concept that promotes a hidden individualization of problems and solutions that ought to be collective. It is a concept that, unless we redefine it, can leave structures of inequity and injustice intact, end quote. Excuse me. Diversity then has become a catch-all for performative allyship. And while many importantly support targeted hires of those who have been systematically excluded in academic spaces, we must also do the work to change the unwelcoming climates, colonialist expectations for scholarship, capitalist relations and conceptions of professionalism, excellence, and impact grounded in hegemonic whiteness, English supremacies, elitism, competition, and individualism. Ways of being that hurt us all, that keep us all from rest and pit us against each other, even among friends. And while so much of this work has fallen onto the shoulders of those who already did the work, lived the work, and required the work to be done for their own humanity or their own hopes for humanity, this work is everyone's, everyone listening. This is ours to bear in various magnitudes. As my amazing friend Kim Lopez reminded, quote, "We are all part of these events. None of us are exempt from these political conversations, and we must all take responsibility for them," end quote. And yet for so many, their identity has held them back out of fear, out of indifference, out of staying out of the way, with so many mixed messages about whose work this is to do, whose voices must be loudest, who should lead and who should follow. So many deferring responsibility and so many others carrying the load they should instead unload and rest from. And this, for me, is where identity politics has been misappropriated, misunderstood, and used as an escape from joining the struggle. And even more dangerous, as in a recent interview, Barbara Smith, who coined the term identity politics in the Combahee River Collective statement, reminded that today many are relying on the identity without the politic. Identity does not always equate to political consciousness. It does not mean one can always articulate the ways in which power relations manipulate our possibilities for existence. And shared identity does not secure being on the same page, connecting as kin, or sharing political desires. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor wrote, quote, "The CRC, Combahee River Collective, was clear that identity politics was not exclusionary, whereby only those experiencing a particular oppression could fight against it. Rather, it was an analysis to validate Black women's experiences while simultaneously creating an opportunity to become politically active, to fight for the issues most important to them. It was a call for solidarity, not by subsuming your struggles to help someone else. It was intended to strengthen the political commitments from other groups by getting them to recognize how the different struggles were related to one another and connected under capitalism. It called for greater awareness and understanding across identity, not less," end quote. Identity was seen as a step towards political consciousness, but becoming politically active was the goal. Similarly, Bell Hooks warned, quote, "The ability to see and describe one's own reality is a significant step in the process of self-recovery, but it is only a beginning. When the idea that describing one's own woe becomes synonymous with developing critical political consciousness, the progress of movements are stalled," end quote. And finally, as Taiwo reiterated, quote, "Contra the old expression, pain, whether born of oppression or not, is a poor teacher. Suffering is partial and short-sighted. We shouldn't have a politics that expects different. Oppression is not a prep school for political development, end quote. And while shared experiences due to identity can absolutely build bridges among us, they aren't necessary to build the politic we need. Politic itself can be enduring, responsive, rooted, and coalitional. It can connect us even athwart identities. Reliance then on identity exclusive formations for liberatory futurities is perhaps what also must be diversified. And this is not against safe spaces or the desire for specified identity convergences, but diversified also that rather than focus only on identity to bind us, the focus could perhaps be more usefully, or at least as usefully, on building strong, shared politic across identities, regardless of identities, a politic of coalition, of radical hope, a politic of solidarity. What if identity wasn't what gave us permission to act towards justice? What if identity wasn't what gave us permission to act towards justice? As Cornel West preached, quote, and in the end we say, we are going to be in solidarity. And that's all we've ever had in human history. There's never a guarantee that what we're trying to do is something we can pull off, but it is a gift we build on and say, yes, that is worth our energy, our vitality, how we look at the world, how we feel, how we act. That's what it is to be a revolutionary, a radical, or somebody who wants to be decent enough to fundamentally transform the structures of domination that are coming at us all, end quote. Part 3, Utopias. Such politic must be felt, supported, and valued within the academy. And even though some will argue the academy is no place for enacting change, I may simply need to read or live more, because for now, I want a radical politic everywhere in whatever form is possible. For me, right now, strong liberatory politic must become part of our existence, academic or otherwise, wherever it finds itself. And it must resound from all corners of the institution. A rejection of the maintenance of what Emma Lee might call the tradition of the establishment men, those policing and privileging Eurocentric epistemologies of empire at the expense of pluriversal notions of everything else. Education must change everything. Education must be enacted and embodied ethics. And as Julietta Singh argued, quote, education must be a transformative act of becoming profoundly vulnerable to other lives, other life forms, and other things that we have not yet accounted for or that appear only marginally related to us, end quote. To heal itself, then, the current university must dismantle itself as is, transform and eventually sever its ties to empire, engage in deep relations, and divest from its traditions of apolitical neutrality. It must sit down, sit back, listen, and learn, and join in the struggle alongside movements towards another world, or render itself and ourselves useless. And academics of all identities must not defer such responsibility. As Taiwo taught, accountability is all of ours to bear, realizing that if we are to be of use to human and more than human alike, it requires us all to acknowledge that our worlds have not been and are not now the way they are supposed to be. We must strive collectively towards critical habits that reverse, reuse, and reorient those tools often relied on for mere performative justice within those spaces in which we find our livelihoods embedded. To be of use, we must work together towards reconfiguring those tools and ourselves into alignments that make more meaningful, less extractive uses of our connections to power and resources, engaging our academic privileges while igniting a radical politic to retaliate against that which was designed to silence, erase, insulate, as Canning might say, burn us down, and fragment us towards inaction. We must not leave justice up to someone else, to someone else's class, to someone else's research, to a week that may easily be skipped. Instead, as Zora Neale Hurston commanded, quote, speak up, rage, because the time for silence has passed, end quote. So for now, as always, I'm left with more questions than answers, more openings than closures, and luckily more hope than hopelessness. And as Sara Ahmed reminded, quote, hope animates a struggle. Hope gives us a sense that there is a point to working things out, working things through. Hope does not only or always point towards the future, but carries us through when the terrain is difficult, when the path we follow makes it harder to proceed. Hope is behind us when we have to work for something to be possible, end quote. And so with educated hope, we move forward not towards new dystopias, but towards the anticipatory not yets of utopias to come. Bloch's notion of concrete utopias that are insurgent, transformative, and filled with potentials of our coalitional struggles, defiant utopias, guided by, as Jose Nunez fantasized, quote, hopes of a collective, an emergent group, or even an oddball who is the one who dreams for many, end quote. As Jack Habersam explained, the dream of an alternative way of being is often confused with utopian thinking and then dismissed as naive, simplistic, or a blatant misunderstanding of the nature of power in modernity. And yet the possibilities for other forms of being, other forms of knowing, a world with different sites for justice and injustice, a mode of being where the emphasis falls less on money and work and competition and more on cooperation, trade, and sharing, animates all kinds of knowledge projects and should not be dismissed as irrelevant or naive. And so then, like Billy Ray Belcourt's book, A History of My Brief Body, this talk too was for those whom utopia is a rallying call. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisbeth, for that very enlightening and stimulating talk. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. And I just want to let you know how you continue to inspire me, and I'm so glad to be in community with you.